Namaste, Raghavji. I can't hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay. Namaste. I sent you a short video, Raghavji. I hope you're able to play it. I sent it to you on WhatsApp. I sent you an email also.
अच्छा. I will just
हाँ, अगर हो सकता है तो when, yeah. I won't share a presentation. It's a short session, so I won't do a presentation or anything. I'll speak. Can you tell me a little bit about this forum, Raghavji?
just
Yeah, sure.
sit down. Yeah. Please tell me.
No, I was just asking who is the likely audience going to be.
Okay. So this will go to our entire community across schools and colleges with
Oh,
whom we interact largely. So there might be some live, but then we will share it through our other channels. Post
right.
that. Yeah. So I have got your video. I will just put it here.
Oh,
So if you have a PPT also, we have time for that matter. So Haley ji would be joining us on 8. So we can, if
no, not on this subject because subject is specifically moksha. Of course, there are
yeah,
many other
yeah,
things.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. So
I will
to
speak for about 20 minutes, and if there are any questions, I'll take that.
sure.
5-10 minutes, and then yeah.
Sure. Just a moment. So we've been reading a lot about your very power-packed aphorisms on IKS, multiple subjects. So
Yeah.
very inspiring and
No. I mean, we are all just doing what we can, right, in the same direction.
yes. So
You're from Delhi, Raghu?
I am originally from Braj Bhumi.
Ah,
Uh,
Jai Shri Krishna.
so then
Ah,
from Braj to Bengal, I was there
okay.
in Kharagpur for 5 years. Then
Okay.
back to Braj, I was restoring the Krishna's ponds, groves, forests.
Ah,
And then I moved on to this educational journalism, like from
okay.
Braj itself. So we engaged a lot of engineering students in developmental work there.
Okay.
Did a lot
Fantastic.
of GIS work, things like that, tourism master plans,
Okay.
like working on the sacred cosmology of Braj Bhumi,
Oh, wonderful.
exploited the 137 sacred groves from
Yeah.
Braj Bhumi Vilas,
Yeah.
plotted them on GIS. And
Acha.
then the government took over, a new body got created by the
Okay.
government. So
So you work full time on education and development work, is it? Or what's
yes,
the
so from development, I moved on full time to this educational
okay.
work. So we engage with the schools and colleges on a lot of narratives, uh,
Okay.
nationalist frontiers, a lot of programs, a lot
Right.
of
Okay.
personalities. Like integral humanism happens to be one of our core thematic.
Okay.
We are doing a lot of things with the because it's a foundational philosophy,
Yeah.
midpoint, but it needs to be expanded. That is important.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think Panditji had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah,
Uh,
but it's very fundamental. If we
yeah,
have
of
been
course.
doing renditions of all these four lectures and
Yeah.
doing some awards around that in that spirit.
Wonderful.
Panditji passed away soon after.
That's the challenge. That's the
Yeah,
challenge. I mean, we were, I think we were deprived of.
yes. So, but this is somewhat, I think, it is again an opportunity in this word like tariff
Yes.
war, Swadeshi decentralization, and technology is helping in a way. Like we can now have miniature technologies to really take on. We don't need giant factories today. So a lot of our friends, like a lot of miniature things have come, which has
It has to.
eased of
It
the
has to
problem.
go back to small.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it won't. Small and decentralized is the only way. That's the Indian way. But
yeah.
connected, interconnected, of course, and integrated.
Yeah. So that remains a big challenge that way. So let's see how it progresses. And as you
Sure.
said that,
Sure.
like yesterday, Rahul ji was with us talking about the Hindu fund. So we
Ah,
uh, uh,
nice.
so we said that he has expanded the envelope from integral humanism to integral Hindutva. And
Ah,
your talk is largely like IKS for us is integral knowledge systems.
yeah.
Everything is intertwined in one, not one
Yeah.
subject that way.
Yeah.
That has been the Bharatiya Parampara.
Yeah.
So Dr. Surbhi, she's the president at Rethink India. So she
Namaste,
from
Subhiji. Namaste.
All India Institute of Medical Sciences.
Ah,
So she champions something called integral healthcare.
oh, wonderful.
So she is integrating the allopathic protocols with the
Yeah.
Ayurvedic Ayush one.
Yeah.
So
Okay. In fact, I was just last week, I moderated a panel. In fact, I curated that panel and moderated it. Of course, the concept was startup and innovation, but I was focused more on civilizational work through that. I had Apollo Ayurved's MD and director, Rajiv Vasudevanji, on the panel,
okay.
and we were talking about the protocols that he has created.
Mm-hmm.
So I was with Apollo sometime. So nice,
Oh, you were?
nice to connect. Yeah. The occupational health department.
So
Yeah.
work is happening on both ends. Like all the new aims have got departments of Ayurveda for that matter.
Right. Yeah.
So P. Ram Manohar sir, like we have.
Yes, I know. Yeah. He's
So
done courses for us. Ramanuj, of course, we know very well.
More inspired by Sir P.
Yeah,
Ram Manohar.
it's an amazing, it's just amazing.
Own work he's doing. And I
let's
how
yeah.
health.
So let's start it off. It's 7. So hello and
Yeah.
welcome. Namaskar. To this ultimate day, 25th of April, which we are commemorating the 6 momentous decades of the advent of the doctrine of integral humanism. It was in the time frame of 22nd to 25th of April that Pandit Deen Dayal ji gave the set of 4 seminal lectures enunciating the soul, the chiti of integral humanism. Very few times, such deep philosophies are presented in such a very simplistic fashion, and that too in so much of brevity. गागर में सागर जो पंडित जी ने भरा है, यही भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा की विशिष्टता है कि क्लिष्टता ना हो, एक आम मनुष्य भी उसको सहज रूप से समझ पाए. एंड दीनदयाल जी, एज वी वर डूइंग द रेंडिशंस ऑफ दीज, उनका वाचन हम लोग कर रहे थे पैरेलली, समानांतर रूप से. तो यही प्रतीत हुआ कि it is not just a philosopher and academic pursuit alone. As a
Yeah.
political activist, he was someone who really propounded that all this needs to be brought on the national edifice. It has to be championed as a part of the programs and policies of the government of the day.
Yeah.
तो इंटीग्रल ह्यूमैनिज्म, एज वी ऑल अंडरस्टैंड, इट इज एक सम्यक भाव है और चतुः पुरुषार्थों के रूप में इसको वीव थ्रू किया गया. We were so very fortunate to have very eminent speakers all through this इंटीग्रल इंडिक इंटेलिजेंस फोरम 2025, जिसके माध्यम से हम इस डॉक्ट्रिन को सेलिब्रेट, कमेमोरेट और इन वॉट एवर लिटिल फैशन राम सेतु में गिलहरी की भूमिका के रूप में हमारा भाव है कि किस प्रकार से हम उसमें अपना योगदान दे सकें इस ज्ञान यज्ञ में. एंड टुडे we are so very privileged and honored to have someone who has the names of two of our greatest avatars in the single name, Raghav Krishna ji, who is the founder of Brahat. And Brahat, as Raghav ji has said, it is a culture engine. We all have talked about the search engines and now the AI bots and all that stuff, but then this is a culture engine which he and his entire spectacular team has curated, which powers creatives, research, and design rooted in the Indian civilizational consciousness. And Raghav ji's Vishay for serving this integral humanism spirit, कि why the Purushartha design was out there in the Indic pantheon. हमारे मनीषियों ने पुरुषार्थों का ये जो समुच्चय जो प्रस्तुत किया, वह क्यों, why, and obviously and how the idea of moksha is critical for contemporary lives. It is not just rinam kratva ghritam pibet. It has a lot of moksha element, and we, as a part of this integral Indic intelligence forum, had celebrated each of the days as one of the purusharthas, and today on this ultimate day, it is the day of moksha. एंड इंटीग्रल मोक्षा बिकॉज सभी पुरुषार्थ एक दूसरे से अंतर्गुम्फित हैं. इट इज जस्ट अ स्मॉल क्रिएटिव कि किस प्रकार से सारे पुरुषार्थ जुड़े हैं. And one of the quotes I would like to read out what Raghavji's quintessential spirit of taking on the IKS, the integral Indian knowledge systems, which we also call it as the integral knowledge systems, that learning is the ultimate force generator. And Hindu civilization mastered this art to think that growth can happen by self loathing is juvenile imprudence. So he's challenging the entire learning community to take on learning in a phenomenal बृहत fashion. एक वृहद मृदंग की जो बात है उसी प्रकार से बृहत भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा की सेवा कर रहा है। और विदाउट एनी फर्दर अडू लेट मी इनवाइट राघव जी, राघव कृष्ण जी, उनका नाम तो पूरा लेने का ही एक आनंद है कि वो अपनी बात रखें और ये जो ज्ञान यज्ञ है इसमें अपनी आहुति प्रदत्त करें। ओवर टू राघव जी।
Dhanyawad. Raghavji, thank you so much. And it's a little disconcerting to have the same name and, Namaste Raghavji, Namaste Raghavji. I think there's a little bit of that. But, thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction. Very, very happy to be here. And like I told you, when you asked me to speak on moksha, I mentioned to you that I am not qualified, from a traditional perspective or from a learning perspective to speak authentically about moksha from a philosophy and metaphysics. And then even Panditji's work, I've read obviously his 4 lectures. I've also read a little bit of literature around Panditji, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert in integral humanism. But what I do bring is a perspective through my journey, which largely converges with some of the framing that you have done for this, right? Particularly the question of design. Yeah, and I like the way that you said this is a Purushartha design, which is a framing that we use as well. And there's a worldview, and that worldview is critical to have a meaningful life. This has been the recognition of my own journey. Like most of our generation, I'm a product of liberalization. I got into the job market in 2001. And I just, like most of our colleagues, you just had to pick up a job and survive. And you had the illusion of growth because the fundamentals were taken care. And I think our life itself is actually a great testimony of why this Purushartha design is so critical. Because if you look at, I speak to many people in my generation now, and they all have the same sort of story that we got into job sector, let's say in 2001, and we defined our success as whatever realm that we were in. You could be in finance, you could be in telecom. I was in gaming for a long time. To contribute positively to that, and through your work, elevate whatever markets you were serving, whatever organization you were serving. But the void was always there. And when I speak and when I reflect on this, I get so much resonance with a lot of people. So you don't need any other pramana. If you actually reflect on your own life and your own journey, and through the intersubjective element of bringing up stories through dialogues, you realize that this design that we're talking about, Purushartha, is not a meta philosophy which is abstract. It is actually the fundamental experience of our own life. If we can afford the truth to reflect upon this and also do that with some authenticity, right? So I speak from that reflection. I don't speak from a traditional understanding of moksha, although I serve tradition through Indian knowledge systems. There is, I think, Purushartha is the central idea that all of Indian philosophical systems converge upon. You might have between one darshana and another darshana certain subtle differences at the ultimate principle on whether it is Dvaita, whether it is Advaita, whether it is Vishishtadvaita. But fundamentally, the congruence and convergence of all the philosophical streams happens around the idea of the fourfold aims of life, right? And why is this critical? And that's where I want to focus on for the next 10, 15 minutes. Before I do that, I also wanted to quickly introduce what we do as Brihat. I have a short 2-minute video, which is also linked to this topic that I wanted to be played for your audience. Architecture to what we call civilization.
Yeah, just played.
I see my friend Kalyan here.
Yeah, Kalyan ji.
Hello.
Is an architecture to what we call civilization and culture. And that starts with wonder. That wonder leads to gratitude. That gratitude leads to curiosity. And that curiosity leads to a sense of ownership. What we do at Brihat is to try and stitch these 4 elements together, linking culture, public policy, and leadership development. We do 3 things. We tell stories about culture. We tell them in the written form. We tell them in the visual form. We tell them in the audio form. We consult with other creative organizations who are doing cultural work. We tell cultural stories about our festivals, about our utsavs, about our civilizational icons. We tell stories across all realms: political, social, philosophical, spiritual, cultural. And then we try and link that to policy, particularly in education, building curriculum for Indian knowledge systems, particularly in higher education institutions. We work in spreading the public narrative about Indian knowledge systems. So the third part of our work is to actually train young people on the civilizational frameworks, to give them the idea of the Kshetrabodh and the Swayambodh and make sure that their learning process is rich and their ownership endures. So these are all of our brands and products. Very quickly, Brihat Mridang is a series of short videos where we try and bring our festivals, our rituals, our knowledge systems, our sense of time into bite-sized small capsules. Next is Brihat Anveshi, the temple assemblies program. This has been truly transformative. I've seen parents taking their kids to temples, and by the time they come back from the experience, they actually tell this to us that they see a difference in their child's behavior. This is transformative just by immersion. Then we have Drashta. This is our online course series. We offer short and medium-term online courses. Fractal Mandala is a very interesting, creative universe that I would encourage everyone to explore. The whole Hindu universe, from Puranic lore to Rigvedic lore, all of that, both visual and also written. Schools of Aryavata, which is storytelling through generative AI, where we talk about our Puranic history in modern contemporary art forms. Then we have Swarnanjali, which is actually our attempt to take back our language, literature, and aesthetics, reclaim it in regional languages. And one of our flagship programs is Niti Vidana. This is where we have an MOU with Ministry of Education, where we do public policy education based on civilizational knowledge systems for the public and also for people in service. We've also delivered a course for Mission Karmayogi, which is on the iGot platform, which is on design thinking for service excellence in public activities, in public administration. Through all of this, the unifying thread is the Dharma Drishti pedagogy, whether it is an article or a course or a temple experience. What we want to leave people with is the idea of making sense through the lens of Dharma. Thank you for that, Raghavji. I thought it was pertinent, not just because it's an introduction to our organization, but also the key elements that is there, we're trying to communicate in that video is fundamentally the process of learning. Right? And learning, when we talk about learning in the Indian Hindu sense, we're talking about a very specific worldview and a vision that we want to curate, which we call the Dharma Drishti. Now, what is Dharma Drishti and why is that relevant? And what is the link between Purushartha and Dharma Drishti? And why is that the design? And why are we talking about the four elements, which is wonder, to make sure that you have moments of wonder as part of your pedagogy? And this is critical because at a meta level, the Indian civilization today, because we are connected with the global civilization, we are moving from an experiential culture to an explanatory one. Right, 20 years ago, if when we were growing up, if we were asked to go to a temple, do the pradakshina for 3 times, take the prasada, and go back, you did not need an explanation for that. Right, you would do that, and there is a whole neural process to this. Jonathan Haidt talks about this in a very good book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he talks about the neural wiring that happens when you go through these rituals. Now, these rituals and the embodied cognition that comes from that meant that your pramana was your own experience, which is the Indian way, which is anubhuti, right? And therefore, you did not need a scientific explanation from outside to validate what was giving joy to you. Because the greatest of experiences in your life, whether it is joy, love, motherhood, parenthood, anything, is not generalizable, is not replicable. It is not something to be measured on a scale. It is truly your first person phenomenal experience that you know as the truth. But today, because of a certain direction that education has taken, both in the pursuit of scientific accuracy, but also a certain kind of cultural production which indexes more on cognitive. And that is why Purushartha is very critical. The idea of integral is very critical because the world has taken a certain direction where it makes tremendous progress on one arc only to realize that there are several losses and trade-offs that we haven't accounted for. Now, what we call in economics, the law of unintended consequences. Now, these are unintended, but it's not like they cannot be anticipated. If you have an integral learning system, you can very well anticipate, and that is why you call yourself a civilization, that you don't need to discover these things afresh every generation. Your civilization has given you the wisdom to balance what is the fundamental truth of human experience. So when we link all these things, we need to begin with the truth of human experience. Right? What is it that we know as true in our own perception, in our own cognition. Now there is, Tagore talks about this, and he actually inquires on this quite a bit on the oddity, and this has been done across Western philosophy as well. But at some point in the evolutionary journey, we've developed the ability to reflect on our own consciousness, right? What the Indian civilization or the Hindu philosophy talks about as Sakshi Bhava in Advaita. Now, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, none of the other species seem to have this need to validate their experience. They are just living the truth of their experience. Now, at some point in time, we can call that, whatever expansion of neocortex, we can talk about the neural system that was developed, whatever science we use. The truth of that experience is that we have this unique ability to reflect and recognize our own experience, to think about our own thinking, to experience our experiences. Now, having given us this, Tagore inquires, why is it that we have such a short life, but we have the ability to reflect on this and also, make sense of all our experiences? Because the more you do it, the more you engage with life and the more you want, right? So this is the essential human condition, that you cannot escape what nature has, built inside of you, which is the ability to validate your own experiences, which means that you can chase pleasure and avoid pain because you're validating your experiences. But in doing so, you also have the reality, the grim reality of a finite life. Now, this is the essential human condition, which leads to a lot of angst, right? Because we want to experience the beauty, we want to stay young, we want all the wonderful things that life has to offer to actually be there forever. None of us wants pain, right? But the fact is that we age, our cognitive capacities decline, our physical capacities decline, and we die. So this is the conundrum. That is the fundamental philosophical question. Now, the West tried grappling with this question, and they came up with many theories, right? This is why Camus famously said, we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. And, some of the other philosophers, even from the kind of Stoic or solipsistic philosophy, they've also framed it differently. And that went into a communist kind of idea that you need to order things around you, right? The challenge is when you have only the repertoire of logic and reasoning to experience and understand life, which is larger than what is graspable by your human logic. You either have a choice to accept your limitation, or you can reject that essential condition and get into a nihilistic mode. What the West has done is, in what we call enlightenment, there's a very interesting exchange that has happened in the West. The reason I'm talking about this is because to understand why and what integral design is and why it is critical, you need to locate yourself in the phenomenon that you're experiencing as a global civilization today. And if you understand that phenomenon, you will see that reason and freedom have become our new gods. This is what has happened as a result of a very particular history that the Western world has taken. Now, West had a very different experience with religion. As far as Abrahamic faiths go, they have a finite system and they have a totalitarian system which demand belief from above. And so for them, faith versus reason, faith versus science is a fundamental challenge. So when enlightenment happened after 600 years of what they themselves call dark ages, they were unleashing their creative potential. They were finally unshackling themselves from the imposition that religion had on them. So when free thinking, reason, and the ability to look at data from an objective lens, empirical planning, all of that emerged, West decisively broke away from the sacred. They've privileged reason and freedom. And this was a seminal movement. And all of our institutions of learning, the reason why you don't have an integral learning today in universities is because knowledge was then compartmentalized into sciences, arts, humanities, and then structured into different departments. Because science became the only arbiter for human cognition and human reason and human progress. And we can empathize with that because, like I said, firstly, the fundamental condition was that it was science that enabled them to get out of the shackles of an imposed faith. But also, if you look at the creative ferment that happened between 17th, 18th centuries, the range of discoveries and scientific advancements that happened in Europe, from Newton to Einstein to Niels Bohr to quantum, all of this suddenly led them into this belief that they've figured the world out, right? You can actually observe the world as a material universe. And the more you sharpen your ability to observe the world, you can actually not just know it, but also architect it, right? So this kind of belief is deeply entrenched in the Western worldview, which then led to a very peculiar organization of knowledge itself in academia, what we call education. Education itself also, got structured that way because West has a schizophrenia at birth. In fact, tomorrow we are releasing a short thread on this. They have a schizophrenia at the Enlightenment birth because the greatest advancement in science around the 16th, 17th, 18th century, whatever time period that you consider as the most fertile, is also the birth of colonization for them. So there is a deeply fractured psyche where the greatest story that they can tell about themselves as the purveyors and the pioneers of modernity is also undeniably the moment where all of that science and technology was deployed to actually unleash violence and capture resources. And this is the danger of a one-dimensional learning. When you reduce human and when you reduce the idea of self to one life, to logical and reasonable and only creatures of reason, you miss out the larger truth that humans need other things to fulfill their own experience. So we began with the idea of fundamental truth, which is that we have an experience of our own experience, but we have a finite life. And different civilizations have approached this condition, these essential conditions differently. Because we are in a West dominated world today, by default, this is also our mindset. We are all living the one life metaphysics. And in a one life metaphysics, it is great violence to have great desires, but a finite time. This is the fundamental reason why you have an epidemic, a global epidemic of loneliness. This is the fundamental reason why you have the idea of mental health crisis and a cottage industry that is brewing around it. If you do not have the fundamental metaphysics to make meaning in life, every institution and every idea that you generate and the knowledge that you generate coming from that paradigm will actually be a greater challenge in the masquerading as a solution. It will be a bigger problem than the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, if you look at it carefully, what has happened in this exchange of gods from religion to reason and freedom, the logic that was given to them is that because human beings are capable of infinite reason, you also demand and deserve infinite freedom. Now look at the violence embedded in this idea. Infinite freedom as the freedom to exploit nature, freedom to impose yourself, because man is positioned as being in war against nature. So you have used your own intelligence and reasoning to give yourself unlimited powers. And in doing that, you have pushed out a certain agenda. And like I said, the more conscientious of them, there is, which is why Nietzsche, which is why Camus came up with this question. What is the ultimate question, whether it is suicide? Because you have a finite life. And if your philosophy is telling you that you only have one life, why should you not enjoy everything that the world has to offer carnally, everything that the world has to offer materially between your 20 and 50 and not commit suicide? This is the question that Camus poses, that the only philosophical question is suicide. What he means by that is that when gods have been abandoned, when your culture and civilization knowledge system is telling you you have only one life, then it is just logical. In fact, you can reason yourself into thinking this, that all I need from life is to live when I am virile, when I am actually capable, when I have the physical stamina. I use this to engage in the world of senses. And by the time I'm 50, when my senses start declining, when my cognitive capacity and physical capacity wanes, I should just commit suicide. This is the question that he was posing. It's a big fundamental challenge to the Western civilization. We have to understand this to understand the beauty of Purushartha design. Now let's look at the Purushartha design and why this is a solution to this crisis of meaning and crisis of belonging that is the biggest crisis in the world today. It is everything else stems from this idea of nihilism. Abrahamic faiths are able to get the kind of traction they do because they offer certitude with one life metaphysics. So to avoid this meaninglessness, you embrace the certitude of whatever happens in heaven once you die, and therefore even moral sanction for violence is easily there, right? Now, if you have to understand this from a Purushartha perspective, look at the organization of Purushartha itself.
Mhm.
You have Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, right? Now, Artha and Kama, which are the fundamental pursuits of your, like I said, your sensory play, your desire for material well-being, your desire for aesthetic and erotic well-being is not denied, but it is bookended by Dharma on one hand and Moksha on one end. It is Dharma that makes the pursuit of Artha and Kama sustainable. Purushartha design is the only way that you can have a sustainable planet. Dharma is the thermostat which is self-regulating your engagement with desires. In a world that is relentlessly telling you that you have one life, all you need to chase is your fulfillment of your material desires, and you have the freedom to do anything. So therefore, there is no restriction. How can you have a sustainable planet with 10 billion people all chasing their material desires? All of us wanting the American life and the kind of per capita consumption that we are talking about. We've also called it development. So the con of language is that it starts with the wrong metaphysics. It gets economized because the genius of the West is also in marketing. The genius of the West is in creating products out of it. And once you create an economy out of it, it becomes a self-serving logic. It will actually create the future it is imagining. If you start imagining that there is infinite growth, and if you take that as an axiom, you will start exploiting nature. And then suddenly you think that there is something called sustainable development. When you start having these cognitive limits, you cheat yourself because it's a sunk cost fallacy. You cannot go back and question your fundamental axioms. That requires far greater honesty than humans are capable of. And culturally, it's not even encouraged. Now, this con of sustainable development is important for us to understand the importance of Purushartha design. And I will end here in 5 minutes for us to understand why moksha is critical. Purushartha design, if you don't have this, look at the con of this framing of sustainable development. You have already called an unsustainable thing development. Having given yourself that idea, now you are going back and saying there is something called sustainable. If it wasn't sustainable, then it cannot be called development. If it is sustainable, you don't need another word. Sustainability is development. In any system, in a family, in an individual, in a society, in a nation, in the planet. This is what we call Ratha. That there is a order to things at the cosmic level, and human life in its social, personal, physical, political, in all manifestations of human endeavor, if you are able to replicate the pattern that is there in nature, which holds things forever. And there's a beautiful Telugu lyric where one of my favorite lyricists, he explains this. And he says, the way to understand this, when you look at the planetary system, we have life as we know now, regardless of what Musk tells us. We might be in interstellar civilization just because he's launched SpaceX. But right now, as we know, life exists only in this planet, right? And it is wisdom, to actually try and save life in this planet, try and create life elsewhere. Be that as it may, but life is possible in this planet because planet Earth is exactly at the distance from sun where the light that you get from sun nourishes and does not kill. If Earth was a little ahead, we would not have had enough sunlight, which is the challenge that we are having with other planets. If it was a little closer to sun, it would have been too hot and we would have been burnt. So life is not possible. So Earth is holding its position, Sun is holding his position, Earth is spinning around herself and also around Sun. There is a finite motion where everything is being kept the way it should be, which is how the fundamentals of life operate. You cannot have this conference, you cannot talk about anything else if that is broken, right? So the Indian mind, when it talks about Purushartha design, it looked at the Andapinda Brahmanda. It said there is an order to universe, and the same order is repeating inside us. Our desires are nothing but cyclical, sort of impressions, right? There's a whole theory to that from Samkhya and Yoga that we get. And therefore, it asked this fundamental question. It did not go the Albert Camus way of saying suicide. It said the ultimate philosophy of life is to go towards moksha. How do you go towards moksha? It has given you the Varna and Ashrama design. The Varna design is to make sure that your Swabhava and Swadharma are mapped. Naturally, whatever your proclivity is. Now, whether the natural proclivity is genetic or it is cultural or it is learned, that is a debate which science also engages in. The West theory that I have found is that it is a gene culture coevolution. That's what science also tells us. But also ashrama, the most important idea of ashrama, that your life has to be divided into four parts: your balya, your yuva, your vanaprastha, and your sannyasa. So moksha has to be understood as the fundamental design, because you said design. Design is setting the right expectations and meeting them. Design is to design the design of a design. This is one of the famous definitions of design, which means that design is intentionality, design is process, design is tools, and design is also the destination. And if you start thinking about Purushartha from a design perspective, you will see that it is anchored in the truth of our life experience of Artha and Kama. But our ancestors have also realized that unregulated Artha and Kama is unsustainable. So they've realized that in nature, everything is held through this principle of Dharma, which is Ratha in the social, political, cultural life of people. But it also gave you the system goal of moksha. And a best way to understand this is from the modern systems theory. Modern systems theory tells you that there are three places of intervention if you want to leverage and influence. Every system is composed of different parts. You can have one level of influence by changing the parts, right? If you want to intervene in a system, you can add one element. In your team, for example, you can add one competency, you can remove one competency. That will have some impact. You can improve the interaction between those elements. That is a higher order intervention. Right? Which means that you can create networks, you can create communication plans, you can create goals, shared vision in organizations that will have certain capacity. But the highest intervention is when the system goal is set in the right direction so that all the elements self-organize. Moksha, the design of moksha, whether that is true or not, of course it is true because it is there in our Shastras. But even if you don't understand this, a life that has the system goal of moksha, which means that as you age, you learn to let go because there is a process of letting go. And it is in this letting go that we create sustainability. If all of us are holding and getting Botox, shots at 60, you will not have a sustainable planet because you are still engaged. This is the inversion that has happened in the Western world, where the more you age, the more you engage in Artha and Kama. It is anti-life. That is why you need a design of trying to find reverse aging, immortality. All of these things are themes there because you don't have a multi-life metaphysics. So in summary, for a meaningful life based on the fundamental truth of our own existence, knowledge systems matter. Knowledge systems which only consider material to be true go in one direction where material expansion happens through the power of science and technology, but they cannot solve the fundamental human crisis of meaning, which is why Purushartha design is integral because it combines the natural quest that humans have with the design of the universe and planet to make sure that there is always this convergence and consonance between the individual and the larger element. That is how sustainability happens. Integral knowledge and integral intelligence is to understand this interdependence and just design and flow with life in accordance with that. Thank you.
I think phenomenal. I think you have solved a very, very critical, I would say, the critical challenge which humanity is facing. And the
I
true
haven't solved it.
you have solved it philosophically. You've given the reasons for it all because the circular economy or whatever concepts the West is actually going through, if you don't let go, I
Yes.
think जो हमारे उसमें ब्रज में
यज्ञ में, yeah.
दो बातन को भूल मत जो चाहत कल्याण नारायण एक मौत को और दूजे श्री भगवान. I think in our भारतीय परंपरा,
Yeah.
all these precepts are so very intertwined.
Yes.
Right from the childhood, the sanskaras are out there.
Yes.
And that's what we are, a sustainable civilization.
Yes.
Sanatan Bharat is Sanatan because
Yes.
of perhaps the Purushartha design, which has been so
It is.
mesmerizingly enunciated by Raghav Krishna ji.
Yeah.
Dr. Surbhi, any questions if you have any comments? Because, yeah.
सबसे पहले तो मैं साधुवाद करना चाहूंगी. Truly, it seems as if in the presence of Raghava, Krishna is imparting knowledge to Partha or Arjuna. I would take the daring and courage to call myself Arjuna, right, in this setting. And truly, Raghav Krishna ji, आपने तो गागर में सागर बांध दिया, and you have given the path to moksha. Why a jiva desires moksha in the very first place, you know, because ये जो मानव चोला है, ये जो birth है, it is a purification process, and this is a step to, you know, escalate, purify your birth, elevate your consciousness, reach the higher. I think some realms they exist somewhere in this ब्रह्मांड. तो वो सब आपने जो है सूत्र में बांध कर इतने संक्षेप में और इतनी सूक्ष्मता से, महीनता से उसको खोल कर सबके समक्ष, हमारी डिस्टिंग्विश्ड ऑडियंस के समक्ष आपने प्रस्तुत कर दिया है. बहुत बहुत आई एम सो ग्रेटफुल एंड सो इंस्पायर्ड, एंड दिस इज absolutely a divine moment in my life. Thank you,
No,
Raghav,
please, no, that
for
is very graceful.
interfacing
Thank you.
me
I'm
with
grateful
such
for the
erudite,
opportunity.
such a divine scholar in all your forms. मेरा एक छोटा सा प्रश्न है, एक सूक्ष्म प्रश्न है, that when you say that Jonathan Haidt talked about the neural wiring.
Yeah.
So, and this neural wiring, you know, जैसे हम कोई टेम्पल जाते हैं या कोई डेटी का दर्शन हम पाते हैं, so how that, I mean, how did it strike you to link this neural wiring concept? How you reached Jonathan Haidt? My curiosity is there for this,
So,
that, you know.
yeah,
And
I think it
how
helps
this-
not being an expert in anything. I have an
Yeah.
active curiosity in different subjects. To me, the integral learning is basically the curation of integral mind, which means that you need to be looking at multiple disciplines effectively and find a creative way to synthesize, right? Human condition, and which is why I spoke about the structural flaw in our education, where knowledge has been distributed into or sort of compartmentalized into sciences, arts, and humanities. And very quickly they become structures and departments and centers and living their own silo. Just because you're learning science, life does not throw you only a science problem. Just because you're a student of arts, life does not not throw you a science problem, right? Life
True.
comes at you integrally, which means that the learning that you need to have to deal with life and be productive and happy, right? The fundamental pursuit is joy. To be joyous, you need to have an integral learning experience, which is what I call Indian knowledge systems. Because Indian भारतीय दर्शन में आप जिधर से भी आप एंट्री कर लीजिए, आप योग से कर लीजिए, आपको बराबर सांख्य में पहुंचना पड़ेगा, आयुर्वेद में पहुंचना पड़ेगा, वेदांत में पहुंचना पड़ेगा, न्याय में पहुंचना पड़ेगा. आप न्याय से पहुंच लीजिए. इफ यू एंटर फ्रॉम न्याय, देन इट विल बी द ग्रामर दैट ओपन्स अप वेदांता. If you start from Vedanta, it'll ask you to go and purify yourself through yoga. It is integral because it is looking at you as a whole being, right? So that has been my journey. And so when but we should also respect, this is not about being antagonistic with the disciplines. West has made great advancements in learning and knowledge with the disciplines, with linguistics, with history, with science. All of these are valid human pursuits of knowledge, but you need to have the right philosophy of that, which is what Bharat can supply. Because the dharma, on the dharma drishti that I spoke about, is the synthesis of all of these disciplines to put it in that pursuit of joy and a full experience of life. If you don't have that, then the challenges that I spoke about of a compartmentalized learning, generating compartmentalized beings, is what is leading to this global pandemic of loneliness, wokeism, everything. It's a fracture in the mind. So I wanted to understand the human mind. That's how I got into Jonathan.
Beautiful indeed. This is so intriguing and so awe-inspiring once again. बहुत बहुत भूरी भूरी साधुवाद आपको और धन्यवाद. Thanks, Raghav, for interfacing with such erudite and such divine scholars. It's truly my really pleasure and privilege and honor to witness such a vaktavya. I'm really spellbound.
Thank you, Radha Krishna. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'll let Kalyan take over.
Yeah. So while we were talking about integral moksha being the ceiling of all the purusharthas, the floor is perhaps dharma. And that's where Halley Kalyanji comes into picture. He would be talking about the advances of dharmic governance in contemporary Bharat and the colossal fault lines which, in his opinion, they obstruct the same and their plausible resolutions. And Kalyanji is one of the very power-packed quotes which we felt very touching was is that some of the descriptions of Kali Yuga in our texts are so damn accurate that it feels like we are reading a 21st century revised and updated edition. A very critical commentator and more so an observer of the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara anchored into the civilizational wisdom of Bharat. Kalyanji is a independent Indian knowledge systems researcher with ample interest in studying topics related to modernity, tradition, and continuity, dharma, ecology, economics, and technology and society. So, quite on the interface of a lot of disciplines in an integral manner, Kalyanji. So, without any further ado, Kalyanji's talk to serve the integral humanism precept over here. Heli Kalyanji.
Namaste, Raghavji. Thanks for the good introduction and
I have to
thanks for
just
having me
change
here.
the backdrop also. I'm sorry. I just.
Oh, no problem.
No, no, I have because that's for.
Edits did for that.
Yes, yes.
Timely.
So, yeah, please carry on.
There now.
All right. Okay. Yeah. All right. So, yeah, I was just saying thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me here. I mean, it's been a while since I refresh my reading of Integral Humanism by Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji. Like I read it maybe when I was in my business school. That's when I was trying to grab a lot of these ideologies and underlying philosophies and all that, right? So I was quite surprised to uh, see this, like how all this came together. So I think there's a lot of effort put in trying to get this contemporary relevance for some of these topics, right? So I do appreciate all that. So this topic that we wanted to talk about today, right? So I think I'll just put some qualifiers and thanks for picking that quote. I think that's from one of my old tweets. Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting thing that we have a quote talking about Kali Yuga and the descriptions in our text. And at the same time, we are also talking about dharmic governance, advances of dharmic governance in our times and obstacles, right? So um, I think one qualifier I'd put is I like personally, I really don't see that we are actually advancing that well in terms of dharmic governance. The only positive I see is that forums like these that feel like people are now much more open. We are talking about all these topics compared to maybe like 15 years ago. It was in a bit of a low tide. Now at least there's much more awareness and there's a lot of discussion happening, right? So let me just start with trying to get some definitions or at least my interpretations on this particular topic, right? So when we are talking about dharmic governance, I think like governance is pretty much a broad-based term, right? It can be governance of anything. So it can be governance of the state, it can be governance of your own family, your society, smaller organizations, so on. But for this talk, I think what I'd restrict myself or the lens that I try to apply is more in the sense of at the like a state, law, constitution, polity, that sort of level, and not necessarily into, let's say, how do I govern my own life or at the like the personal sort of a space. So what I'd like to try to draw this schism, if I'd like to use that word, right? I think after the colonial epoch is where this whole what is a dharmic sphere, what is a secular sphere, or what is a religious sphere, what is a secular sphere, all of that came up. Prior to that, really, if you look at it, if you ask, I mean, if you were to time travel and then go back and ask our ancestors to define what is secularism, what is dharma, they wouldn't probably have an answer because there was nothing called secularism. Your entire life was practically dharma. Like what you do for your livelihood is dharma, or your technology also has a shastra around it, your art has a shastra around it. So practically everything is dharma there. So today when we are talking about dharmic governance, I think it's also because perhaps we are seeing some sort of an adharmic governance, which is why we are feeling, oh, if this is not that, then there should be something else, right? So we are trying to draw that contrast. Otherwise, this whole idea of dharmic governance would have been irrelevant for some of our ancestors because their entire universe used to run on dharma, right? So I think there's also this very interesting passage by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. I think that's something that I remember where he was trying to draw this comparison across all religions. And then he says, he tries to draw this difference between how Hinduism is different from other religions. And in fact, he also contests the use of that word religion for that matter. So there's something that he says, which I think is relevant for this topic today, right? So he says that with other peoples, religion is only a part of life. There are things religious and there are things lay and secular. But to the Hindu, his whole life is religion. So that's broadly how most of our ancestors saw life as well. Instead of using the word religion, we perhaps use the word dharma. So when we are talking about dharmic governance, I think a more fundamental question is more in terms of what then is dharma, right? I think that is where like things get a lot more difficult for people in our times today, because a lot of us also are trying to understand that in the mold of uh, religion, in the mold of, let's say, how Christianity operates, how Islam operates, so on. So for many a times when you bring this whole topic of dharma into the discourse, it is always drawn as a contrast. So you want something other than secularism? Is this like a theocracy? Is this like Taliban? It is that sort of things. Because the only imagery we have of something that runs off religion is basically the like an Islamic setup, or like a Christian theocracy, that sort of a thing. A lot of us really have lost this sense of what really dharma is. So what is called like dharma ka swarup, which means the whole expanse of dharma, what it is, right? I think we don't have a great idea beyond like our own small personal spaces. Like we have a sense of dharma in terms of respecting elders, like the like a marital relationship, husband and wife. I mean, we don't really break our relationships, and people don't get into multiple. So some of those are still intact, right? And then we respect our gurus. So we have these things here and there. We celebrate our festivals. So we have it in the personal spaces. But the moment you shift the gaze and then say, then tell me the role of dharma in constitution framing. Tell me the role of dharma in terms of how law has to happen. Tell me the role of dharma in terms of how markets have to be regulated. Tell me the role of dharma in terms of how commerce has to happen, how trade has to happen. A lot of these, right? That's where I think we go blank, because we have been coached over time, primarily post the colonial epoch and much more faster after independence, to restrict dharma to private spheres, and then leave everything in the public spaces to what is broadly called as the liberal secular sort of a discourse. So I think when you are talking about the dharmic governance, the way I'd look at it is running it based on this whole liberal secular sort of framework. We need to acknowledge that either it already is adharmic governance or it leads you to an adharmic mold. Only then that you'll actually come back to understand why you even need dharma in these public spaces, right? Otherwise, broadly, a lot of us even think that the state that we are in today is progress, which means people have been liberated from the shackles of religion. They can do whatever they want. They're like patriarchy is no longer there. Nobody is trying to control your vritti dharma, and that's how it's marketed, right? Like this what this break is actually marketed as progress. But I think for this sort of a topic and for this sort of a deliberation, we need to also then think a bit further and also look at how secular liberal polity is really operating across the globe, particularly in the context of woke liberalism, in the context of a lot of the hate that is perpetrated by certain Abrahamic religions and all that, right? So at some point, we need to then realize that this liberal secular model of governance is really not our model. And our model of governance is dharmic governance. And that is where I think we need to get back to this question of understanding what I'd say is Dharmaka Swarup. And I think that's where like we also need to start engaging with our Shastras, because again, that's another blind spot broadly for Hindus today, where we tend to define dharma as like something that I discover on my own, like my own, or at best, like my own family's tradition, like my kul parampara or my family parampara sort of thing. But we don't have a great view in terms of governance of systems and institutions, right? So that's where, if you look at the whole Shastra discourse, there is a quite a lot of corpus. If you look at Rajaniti, if you look at Rajadharma, if you look at Ardhashastra, if you look at even like Mahabharata, like Shanti Prabha, in Ramayana also, there's a lot of discussion between Rama and Bharata. I mean, across the board, right? Like you'll find it everywhere in terms of how should the king conduct his Raja, how should the Rashtra be, and how should smaller, let's say the Janapadas or villages or those, how should they conduct their affairs. So we are actually quite big in terms of governance in our own discourse. Somehow, surprisingly, like we have become blind to all of that over the years. So a lot of, in fact, like even if you check on YouTube, right? For example, just look for lectures on Rajadharma, for example. You'll barely find anything, but you might find a lot on, let's say, Gita, on Upanishads, on Ramayana, largely on or like on the Bhakti sort of a space, right? There we are quite big, like because I think that's again in the private sphere, right? Where people want to pursue their own sadhana, their own upasana, and their own relation with God, so to say. So there, I think we are quite active. But if you start to look at what is the broader discourse in terms how do we govern ourselves, you'll barely find much of a discourse. In fact, I mean, things are just picking up, particularly, I mean, this gap is more in English. I'd also put that qualifier. There's a lot of good work that has happened over the years, be it in Sanskrit or in Hindi or in regional languages, you will find sources. But in particularly in the English sphere is where I think there's a lot of these gaps. In fact, I think like Raghava spoke right before me, and on Brihat, I think yesterday or day before, there was an article by Dr. Srinivas Jamal Madko on a very related topic on Shastra and state. So he was also referring to some of the works from like Shastra, Kamandaka Nitisara, so on. I think that's the kind of space where we are not we're not producing as much content as we should be, because it almost appears for somebody who is trying to, let's say he's not connected to a parampara and he's trying to gather this information, right? For such people, it may even appear like, oh, maybe there's not a lot of content on this. So maybe Sanatan Dharma is not really about all this. It's maybe just about the private space. So I think that's the gap that we need to really address in terms of this. One, we need to also build this argument on why this is really relevant now, which is where I think what I just mentioned, that we need to also build a comprehensive understanding of what is it that we are going to miss if we keep going on this liberal secular sort of a trajectory as far as the public spheres are concerned. So thankfully, I think our paramparas on some of these matters are still intact, and a lot of dharmacharyas also exist who continue to deliberate on these topics. Again, like they may not do it in English, but you'll see a lot of this kind of thinking across the board. So there's also this whole link between the darshana sort of discourse and this, right? Which is how do you like look at life broadly? So that's kind of ties back to what Raghava was just mentioning in the previous talk. So we lot of our systems today pretty much operate in this you only live once sort of a YOLO sort of a frame, which is that single life metaphysics, right? So in our darshanas as well, you'd also see like a Charvaka darshan, which perhaps comes closest to this YOLO sort of a time frame. And then you have Jain and then Nyaya, Vaisheshika, all of that, right? So at some level, we need to also understand that how do each of these things impact governance? So if I am like believing in Paraloka, how is that going to influence my governance? If I am believing in Punarjanma, then how is that going to influence my governance? Versus if I am going to believe just in a YOLO materialistic sort of a framework, how is that going to influence my governance? How is that going to influence my laws? How is that going to influence my constitution and all of that? So I think that's where I believe we need to delve a bit deeper in terms of understanding that all of these ideas have consequences. So if you are saying Punarjanma and Paraloka believing person or a believing civilization operates in a certain way, then that will also get reflected in terms of how they govern themselves. So unfortunately, what has happened is in the because of this whole secular sort of a predicament that we are in, we kind of ended up with the lowest common denominator. So if you take away all these layers of darshanas saying that, oh, but this doesn't appeal to that person, that doesn't appeal to this person, right? You'll just end up with the Charvaka frame, because the Charvaka is like the base level of the human emotions. It's maybe just one layer above the animal layer, or perhaps closest to the closest to being like a pashu, for example, because the animal also doesn't have much of this sort of a mechanisms, right? It's just concerned about eating, sleeping, and reproduction. That's pretty much it. But if you look at our whole Shastra discourse, the way it is built up is that they say that following Shastras is what distinguishes a human from an animal. So they say that if you don't do this, then you are actually debasing yourself to the lowest level. So I think right now, in terms of governance as well, that's really our challenge, that we have reduced, we have like peeled out all these layers and then left the base layer of the Charvaka sort of a frame, which says that there is nothing beyond and it's just a materialistic sort of a mindset, right? So I think that's the frame in which our whole system pretty much is operating. And I think that is what needs to be contested. So if we have to really move to a dharmic governance sort of a mold, then these are all the things that we need to challenge. So at some level, we'll have to say that all darshanas are not the same. And there is a reason why Charvaka is put as the first darshana, and there is a reason why every other darshana actually tries to refute Charvaka as you move from Charvaka to the next of the darshanas, right? But today, a lot of the Hindu discourse, unfortunately, is also in this mold where we try to look at Hinduism from the liberal lens. So we have a problem in saying that all darshanas are actually not the same, because it makes us appear like illiberal, it makes it appear like discriminatory, and all of that. And that has a very profound impact on governance layer as well. Because unless you say that this idea is important and this idea has consequences, this is a bad idea, it has bad consequences, we cannot make any progress. So long as you say that all ideas are the same, then we will just remain where we are. So I think that's another thing that we need to confront when we talk about this whole dharmic governance versus adharmic governance sort of world. So the other part again is the whole need for this dharma or dharmic governance or dharma shastra based governance. All of this emerges is also that in the absence of all this, what you'll have is the Matsya based system, right? Which is the law of the fish, the big fish eats small fish sort of thing, which is pretty much how a lot of the West operates today. We also explain that by saying survival of the fittest. Some of them, like people also call it as social Darwinism, where they are bringing the one sort of an interpretation of Darwin into social, political, and policy and all of these spheres, right? Where we tend to see this thing that this is how things are going to be. Big fish will always consume small fish, survival of the fittest, fight it out sort of a thing. But our whole Dharma Shastra discourse is actually saying that this Dharma and Shastra is needed because if you don't do it, then you'll end up as a Matsya based society. So the whole thing is to thwart that sort of a system that we need a dharmic governance. But unfortunately, today we are saying we are actually accepting that Matsya is perhaps the way of the world and then trying to work around that. But our whole discourse is actually saying you need dharma because you have to, you otherwise you'll fall into that pit of Matsya. So I think that's again a very important thing that we need to understand, right? And another thing that I wanted to briefly touch upon is also, so when we are talking about dharmic governance, I mentioned multiple spheres at the start, right? Like there is personal law, there is commerce, trade, polity, constitution, all of that. Let's say even if you take something like personal law, right, which is in terms of how you conduct your own life, your relationship with the other gender, marriages, and all of that. So if you look at our dharmic sort of a model, we have this thing that like Parastri Apaharan is a papa, which means that you should not lust after someone else's woman, you should not kidnap that person, all of that, right? I mean, the entire Ramayana discourse is really around that one sin that like Ravan committed, right? And then if you look at what are courts pronounced today on some of these topics, they are now saying that adultery is not a sin, it is all right, and we need to evolve and all of that, right? So again, this brings up that whole dharmic versus adharmic sort of a mold, that how can you have a constitutional morality which says adultery is all right, and then how can you have a cultural setup which says that that is a papa, and you have an entire epic written around trying to lust over someone else's wife, right? So this is the conflict. When we are talking about a dharmic governance, the need for dharmic governance is really this, because you cannot have a Sanskriti that is based on some values, and you cannot have a constitution and law layer that is based on some other values. So if that is based on this value that individuals should be able to do whatever they want so long as there is consent, and the culture layer is trying to say that no, this is punya, this is papa, this should be done, this should not be done, and these are the consequences and all that, right? This conflict cannot run for so long. At some point, we have to say, if I want to retain my cultural consciousness, then my law and my governance layer also needs to be per dharma. That cannot be for adharma. So I think for a long time, what we have done is we have assumed this is okay. Like let the constitutions, let the law, and let the governance layer run as per the liberal, secular, enlightenment sort of a value system. And in my own spaces, I'll still be a Hindu. Like I'll still do my prayers, I'll do my vrat, and I'll do my puja and all that. But I think, thankfully, like personally, in terms of my own journey, in the past 10 years, if you look at how the West has also transformed with this whole wokeism and culture wars and all of that, right? Somewhere you'll also see a lot of these Western discourse that has now come up, where they are also contesting this whole liberal, secular, enlightenment values sort of a setup. In fact, there are articles written saying that there is no such thing as secular neutrality. There are Christian conservative thinkers who are now saying that why is it that we have to give up this space to secularism? And why is it that like an Anglo-Saxon Christian norms cannot dominate law? Why can't it dominate American law? Why can't it dominate European law? There are people asking this sort of questions because they have also realized that they have also uncritically accepted this liberal secular sort of setup so far as governance is concerned. And now they are like it's biting them, and they have realized maybe they have made a mistake. And in our case, we didn't even do this sort of an analysis. We just took it, like whatever came from the colonial epoch, we just took it uncritically, and then we are now stuck with it. So much so that we don't even have this conception of how to have like a dharmic governance sort of layer. Like a Christian conservative thinker today can say, I want to have American law and policy run as per Anglo Christian norms, because he still has a conception of Christian law. And for us, in our case, although Hindu law is a bit of a wrong term to use in this context, but we still don't have a conception of how to run our affairs with Hinduism being the like the primary layer. We are still relying on this whole constitutional layer for a lot of our life, and then restricting ourselves to the private space. So I think this epoch is particularly good for these discussions, because at least we can see that rest of the world is also asking these questions. Maybe if this was like 20 years ago, it would still have been that, why are you asking this? Look at America, they're all okay with secularism. Look at Europe, they're all running with liberalism. Why are we alone not adapting to it? We should adapt to it and progress. But now, thankfully, even there are so many voices that have come up. There are who are saying that liberal neutrality is actually like a Trojan horse for smuggling progressive philosophy, like this endless progress sort of a mold, right? I mean, they said so many things have to progress, and then they got into the gender ideology, then they got into all of those other aspects, right? Because progress is like an endless train that doesn't have any boundaries. And our whole Shastra Dharma discourse is really about all those boundaries and putting those limits and helping us navigate through this whole uh, uh, path of life. And it's really about these limits, context sensitive rules, and all of that. And this whole progress train is really about defying all norms. So it is about questioning all norms. Whatever, let's say if you have 10 taboos in your society, right? Like do this, do that, sort of thing. The whole woke liberal sort of a discourse is to say, I will do that and you should accept that, because it's like in a norm defying sort of a mindset. Any norm you say, they try to defy it. Now I think that's where the West has woken up, saying that I don't want this norm defying sort of setup, and I'd rather have something based on my own religion than like ceding this space to secularism. So I think that's where we also need to see this whole dharmic governance sort of a discourse, that we need to acknowledge that this model is in some sort of a conflict with this whole secular neutrality or liberal neutrality sort of a setup, based on which the entire governance layer is running today. So we need to like really contest that, and take that much more seriously. In fact, so there's also like one more example I'd like to cite from the West. I think this came in Guardian or one of these newspapers. This was around some of these debates in the United Kingdom around assisted dying. So if, I think this keeps happening in the West, like in Canada also, it was there in Europe and all these places, right? Essentially, like the ethical obligations around permitting somebody to die when they want to die. Is it the right thing to do? So on. So in some of these legal discussions, which happened even in like I think this was in the UK Parliament, if I remember right, where one of these people said that this is wrong as per Christianity. You should not be doing such things. And then that person was actually forced to say that whatever I say, my opinions are because I am a Christian, and my opinion is because of I am a part of this religion, and my religion is actually conditioning me to say this. They had to actually confess this like this. And then that person later wrote an article saying, why is it that I had to confess, but others didn't have to confess, saying whatever I am saying is because of enlightenment or because of secular neutrality or secularism. So at some level, these systems, the way they are built is that religion needs to be kept out of the doors. If it comes inside, it should come with a confession. But there is this whole sphere created for secular neutrality, and that can still that has really like a hegemony sort of a thing, where no, like you'd never see a secular intellectual confess saying that I'm saying this because I'm a secular person, because that's taken to be as the way of the world. The people from who follow religions, at some point they have to give up and then merge into this ocean of secular liberal neutrality. That's how that's pretty much how a lot of this policy governance and law sort of a space operates. And I think that's where I think this era particularly is good for these discussions, because this is where the entire West is pretty much like waking up to all of this. Now, another piece that I wanted to briefly also touch upon here is that one of the key issues when we start talking about these topics is also that given the way the whole discourse is set up today, everything is connected to everything else. So we may think that, like, let's say we are talking about dharmic governance, so let's not talk about Aryan innovation theory, for example, right? But the way the things are is that if you're saying that my country is Hinduism matters for this country, Sanatan Dharma matters to this country, and then the dharmic values matter to this country, you'll also have to justify this question that is this indigenous to this country? Why is, I mean, if Sanatan Dharma is important, why is Christianity not important? Why is Islam not important? And all of these, right? So if you look at how our own dharmacharyas and those sort of people have also conducted this discourse, at some point you'll also have to say that for this country, for Bharata Desha as a whole, right? That for Bharatiya Sanskriti as a whole, Sanatan Dharma is what is the life-giving force. You cannot say that all religions have an equal stake on that particular matter. At some point, you'll also have to say that this country, this is like a Hindu homeland. This is where Sanatan Dharma really, this is like the fount from which like Sanatan Dharma sort of flourishes, right? So we cannot operate in this mold where we say that like no religion is native to this land. All religions have come at some point in time. Some came before, some came after. So it is all right. So we cannot operate in that sort of a neutral space. If we are talking about dharmic governance, we should also talk about how dharma is fundamental to the conception of this country and the people of this land. Now, again, that's again difficult for a lot of Hindus today because for some strange reason, I mean, you'd find a lot of discussions in 20th century on some of these topics where a lot of Hindus were actually quite active. A lot of our dharmacharyas were also quite active on these sort of topics. Over time, somehow a lot of Hindus just don't want to confront any of these. Like it's like we want to operate as if none of these matter and we can still go on with our lives. But if you go deeper and deeper to any of these conversations, you cannot have like a position where you say that this view is also all right, that view is also all right, sort of a thing. Like you cannot say that it is all right if you believe that Hinduism came from outside. It is all right if you believe that Hinduism is native to this land. It doesn't matter. So we cannot have that sort of a lax sort of a position. Because if you are saying that dharmic governance matters for this landmass as a whole, right, then you should also defend for the central role of dharma, Sanatan Dharma, Hindu Dharma, in the context of this land. So I think that's again very important, and it's very it's like a difficult, a bitter pill sort of a thing that a lot of people have a trouble biting in these days. In fact, in some of my own interactions, I remember like particularly this happens with people who are not residing in India but still very interested in Hinduism, right? So a lot of our NRIs, PIOs, sort of people, after a point, it gets very difficult for them because they know that they are living in a land where maybe Hindus are like 2% or 1% or 3%. So this sort of a discourse where we are saying what is the role of Hinduism in governance, in constitution, in law, in polity, that gets very difficult for them to manage because for them it will be like, but like I cannot implement this on my land because I am just a 1% sort of a person. So they sort of keep this all aside because it just feels like an impossible problem to solve for them, and they restrict themselves to Hinduism in the private sphere. Unfortunately, like a lot of Hindus in India also take this position, and that is what is worrying. Like, if at all there is any land where we can actually show the relevance of Hinduism and the Sanatan Dharma in all these spheres, that has to be India, because this is the only place that has like the largest mass of Hindus even to this day, right? So I think Hindus in India should not give up on this topic because it's very important for the whole civilizational survival and continuity broadly. And it's also important in the context of like this whole demography changes that's also happening on the land, right? Where there's so many parts of the country today where Hindus are not like as much of a majority as they were in the past. There are many places where it is shrinking also. So at some point, if you don't appreciate the like the role of Sanatan Dharma and Hindu Dharma in all of these spheres, at some point we'll get complacent and we'll just succumb to the lure of this whole secular liberal neutrality sort of a thing. And even the shrinking Hindu demographics also will not become a concern of governance. So I think the challenge is unless you bring this into the center, you cannot even argue that shrinking Hindu demographics is a problem. Because if you take a purely secular liberal sort of a position, right, then it doesn't matter if India has like 50% Hindus or 10% Hindus or 5% Hindus, because from a strictly secular neutrality sort of a position, the religion is in the private sphere, so it doesn't matter how many Hindus are there in the country. And that's the danger I think we'll get into if we just seed this whole space into the secular frame. Only if you bring Hinduism and put it back into the center, that is where these also become a concern of like a governance concern, that let's say there is a government policy that is happening or something like that, right? That also need to have this at the center, that I cannot afford a scenario after 10 years, after 20 years, where like Hindu demographic shrinks in this particular region. In the olden days, let's say if you're the king, right? The Hindu Raja could not have said that I'm okay if my people are not from my religion. And we cannot go into that sort of a mold. I think that's where it's important to get the Hindu Dharma into these spaces. Otherwise, it's very difficult to argue. Like I said, from a very standard secular liberal sort of a frame, it is you cannot even bring demographics into the discussion because it doesn't. I think that's again like another area where it's very important to understand like why this whole discourse on dharmic governance is really important. Now, if I also take a few examples, right, like from some of our own sources, for example, like Ardhashastra or Kamandaka Niti Sara and other such works, where there are like, I mean, these texts really deal explicitly about how should the state conduct itself and how should the king conduct himself and how should governance happen across various layers. And there's a lot of very specific advice given in terms of what are the qualities that one would need so that dharma flourishes on the land in for that time duration or for that period when the king is ruling, so on, right? So if you look at something like, let's say, like a temple governance sort of a thing. Now, today, temple governance also is a huge challenge for us to talk about in some of these spaces, because it's like we have a very unique model of secularism where on the matter of temples, the government says like they suddenly become very religious, where they say they want all the control. But on other matters, they say that, oh, don't bring religion into it, we are secular. So if you look at some of these Rajaniti or broadly Rajadharma sort of a discourse on some of these temple governance, for example, there's a lot of elaborate descriptions written in terms of how the temples need to be governed, who should own the temples, what is the relation between the king and the temple. So there are like specific tenets. For example, if you look at like Kamandaka Niti Sara as one particular book where some of these things are dealt with, right? There's a lot of uh, deliberation there in terms of what should you do with temple money, like what purposes should temple money used for. And the king is actually told, if you are going to appoint somebody to look after the temple, make sure you don't appoint somebody who is just like a greedy person or a materialistic sort of a person, because then he's going to use the temple money for other purposes, and he's also going to lure you with the like the smell of money, basically. But today, if you look at how we operate, right? I mean, we do the total opposite. So today we have in some of the states, like if you take a state like Tamil Nadu, for example, which has got some of the biggest and largest temples, the temple money and temple wealth kind of gets used for all sort of purposes. I mean, Tamil Nadu is just one example. It is not that it doesn't happen in other states. I just took that example because that has the highest density of temples, but it does happen in all places, and it happens across political parties as well. So this has nothing to do with the party affiliation. It's just how the structure operates. Because I think from the secular frame, you cannot take this whole decision that temple money is different from uh, regular tax money that you collect, right? Because it doesn't matter from that frame of mind. Unless you are, if you are like truly secular, the way, let's say, some of the Western countries are on this matter, then you might as well say that the government has nothing to do with managing temples. We don't do that either. We say that the government manages temples and then we let it manage as per secular laws. And that's, I think, very weird. And that's where I think when we are talking about dharmic governance, we should at least then, so if we are saying that the government is interested indeed in managing temples for whatever reasons, right? Then they should at least take this dharmic temple governance sort of uh, uh, things that we have and at least accept this much. So it's all right. Like if I'm not doing the purest form of temple management, right? At least within these constraints, I should at least say that I am going to use temple money only for religious causes. Even that can only happen if you bring Sanatan Dharma into the governance layer. If you don't bring that and you leave it in the private spheres, even that discussion cannot happen. So I think these are where probably like I feel Hindus need to spend a lot more energy on to understand what really our texts say, what do our ancestors say on these topics, what do our dharmacharyas say, what do our shastras say, so on. So like again, just continuing on the Kamandaka Niti Shastra sort of a topic, right? So there, like it's very clear that so like it talks about like three elements for Raja or Rashtra overall. So there is Bhumi, which is land. So that is the like the allegory or analogy there is that the Bhumi is the body or sharir, and then people are the prana or the life force for that particular Bhumi. And then culture or Sanskriti is put as like the manas or mind or intellect. Now, if you look at this threefold distinction here, right? So there is this idea that the land is sacred. So there is Bhumi, the land is given. The analogy is like it's like your body. So the land is like your body, and then the life-giving force for this land are the people on the land. And what is the mind or intellect, or what is the thinking part of it, which drives this body and life-giving force together? That is what is called Sanskriti. Now, in this context, if we are to define what is the Sanskriti that defines this particular land called Bharatadesha, that Sanskriti cannot be constitution, because that constitution doesn't, that's not the function of the constitution really. And that Sanskriti cannot be like enlightenment or liberal neutrality or secularism, because these things were even in the world history, they were born like 16th or 17th century. So, but this land existed even before that. These people existed even before that. And this culture itself is perhaps the longest continuing cultural continuities that are there today. So somewhere we'll have to acknowledge this fact that what is the core of this, the Sanskriti of this land, that is Sanatan Dharma or Hindu Dharma. It cannot be anything else. So at some point we cannot dilly-dally on this topic. We have to be very clear that this land is the Hindu homeland and this is how it is going to be. And only when we do that can we do this dharmic governance sort of a discourse better, because the dharmic governance will have to come from a Shastra or Dharma sort of a frame. That is the one which can tell you what to do. So to acknowledge that or to pass that authority to that layer, you need to acknowledge the centrality of Hindu Dharma and Sanatan Dharma to this land. Without that, that authority or this whole Dharma Shastra body will not get that authoritative power or legislative power for that matter. I think that's I think very important in this particular context. Now, the another thing that I'll just take like a couple of minutes to talk about one more aspect and then maybe conclude. So, if you look at any of these discourses on Raja Dharma, Rajaniti, on Dharma in governance and all of this, right? One very like constantly recurring theme is of Rajadanda, or even like Rajanumato Dharma sort of thing, or Yadha Raja Tada Praja, all of this, right? Which is it like kind of that's like a top-down aspect for it. It's not something that each of us can figure out on our own and like each of us can have like our own version of it sort of thing. There is also a top-down aspect of it, which is the Rajadanda aspect. Like a lot of our conduct is also defined based on what is deemed as good or bad by the state. So if you go back to that example of adultery that I gave, right? So if your Raja and your like your Sanskriti and your Rajadanda both are like on the same frame, then adultery becomes a sin for both. Like the king will also punish you for it and your Sanskriti will also police you against it. But if you have this conflict between the Rajadanda is really listening to secular neutrality, then that will say that individuals should be able to do whatever they want so long as there is consent and all of that, right? So that conflict between Rajadanda and Sanskriti is very unique to this epoch. And if you see why that conflict is there, it is because the Rajadanda is really listening to Enlightenment values and the Sanskriti is still clinging to the Sanatan values. So there is this conflict. In fact, if you look at some of our judgments that are given in the courts and all of that, there's a very explicit wording where they say that constitutional morality is different, societal morality is different. And constitution really exists to protect the individual from being exploited by the societal morality. There's like many judgments. It's not just one or two. You'd find in the last 70, like 70, 80 years, right? You'd find so many judgments where uh, somebody will go to court saying that my culture is preventing me or my tradition is preventing me from doing so and you protect me. And then the court takes this position that, oh, we need to reform, these are outdated norms, this is not an essential religious practice or like all of that, right? So I think this conflict is really happening because governance is we have to admit that the governance is tuned more towards adharma than dharma, because the governance is not respecting any of the sources that tell you what dharma is. So if the governance layer is really saying that shastras are outdated, then you are never going to make it, because shastras are the ones which are going to tell you what is dharma, what is not. And when I say shastra, it is not in the mold of one book. It's a mold of, like, shastra is acharas, parampara, and then you have vidhi, nisheda, you'll have various sampradayas and all of that, but it's still not individuals' whims. So I think the difference is the modern model is to say that the individuals should be able to do whatever they want, and the courts will protect the individual's right to be exploited from tradition. So even if you take something as simple as like Sagotra Vivah, right? In a lot of traditions in the country, people don't marry within the same Gotra because that's considered as a sin per tradition. But there have been cases where the courts say that these sort of things are like outdated, it is okay, you can do whatever you want, sort of thing. And there are cases where like panchayats and these local bodies have gone to courts and then saying that how can you go against my tradition? So I think this conflict between the governance layer and the tradition layer, this never existed really in our past, and not at this scale at least. So when you're talking about dharmic governance, I think all of this need to be put in context. It's not like a very like I'd say it's not a simple problem to solve, because you'll really have to undo and like unlearn and relearn a lot of concepts which are like for 3 generations almost, right? Like if you look at the from the colonial era to now, I mean, like 1947 to now, and if you look extend it to colonial era, maybe it's like another 6 or 7 generations. So many generations we have been trained on this model. Now we have to unlearn all of that model and then really understand the full expense of dharma. So I think it's not a like an easy problem to solve, but I mean, if we are really caring for our civilizational continuity, we don't have any other option but to solve for this problem. Like we have to get there and we have to confront all these questions and articulate all of these positions, study all of this more, get more and more of these topics into the public spaces, like engage with Hindus. And more Hindus need to be appreciative of why this is an important problem to solve and how to solve it both. So yeah, I think that's where I'd like to conclude. So, yeah. Thank
I
you.
think Heli ji has really given that core crux of it all in lecture 3. Deen Dayal ji goes on and on about a Dharma Rajya, and Heli ji has really expanded the entire spirit of Deen Dayal ji, where he puts that in Bharat, even the king is below Dharma. So he puts that Dharma, and what Raghav Krishna ji had mentioned earlier, it's an integral framework, what Heli ji has said, and that's why there always has been a talk of dharma sthapana, that because for a dharmic governance framework to operate, it has to be established first. So the euphemism around dharmic governance or whatever we are trying to pass on, without mincing words, he says that you have to adopt it in toto, the entire purushartha design, which only can be accepted in the sanatan bharatiya purity. It just cannot be an assimilation from here and there. The
Correct.
foundational कहीं की ईट और कहीं का रोड़ा और भानुमति ने कुंदा
Exactly.
जोड़ा, that is
Yeah.
somewhat a criticism for the Indian constitution, which we somewhat mistakenly take a lot of pride in, that it is the largest, lengthiest, bulkiest written document in the history of word. But somewhere or the other, and that's where Deen Dayal ji has also in his Integral Humanism in lecture 3, he goes to the extent between a federation of states towards a unitary India. And from that very fundamental vantage, he says that भारत माता को हम अलग अलग माताओं में विभक्त नहीं कर सकते हैं. I think
Mhm.
that is the spirit, that is the puritanical spirit, which does not have a negative connotation. A purist first principles approach of Sanatan Bharat,
Correct.
आई थिंक हेली जी हैज इन द कल्याण भाव. और बहुत ही सुंदर उनका एक व्याख्यान है, क्योंकि आज हम उन्हीं के डॉक्ट्रिन्स को मना रहे हैं, और हमारी जो सभी वाचक हैं, सभी प्रबोधक, और आई वुड से द स्कॉलर्स वर रियली एसिमिलेटिंग इट, एंड दे हैव दैट जज्बा. कल हम राहुल दीवान जी को सुन रहे थे, तो विद व्हाट वर्व ही वाज स्टैंडिंग अप फॉर दिस हिंदू रिसर्जेंस मूवमेंट, जस्ट टू अशर ऑल थ्रू. तो उन्होंने यही कहा कि भाई तिरुपति बालाजी में भी पैसा लिया जाता है दर्शन के लिए, और 1 घंटा धर्म दर्शन कहा जाता है, एज इफ द रेस्ट ऑफ द दर्शन इज अधर्म दर्शन. सो इन इज ओन सैटिरिकल मैनर व्हाट हेली जी इज सेइंग कि भाई आप टुकड़े में धर्म को नहीं धारण कर सकते हैं. यू हैव टू टेक इट इन इट्स ओन ऑर्गेनिक फ्रेमवर्क. दैट्स व्हाट डिजाइन इश्यूज, आई थिंक आफ्टर द इंटीग्रल मोक्षा, this integral dharma, this was more about a talk on integral dharma, that dharma has to be seen in integration with the other purusharthas. And until or unless we accept that in totality, it's not going to function. I think Dr. Surbi has a kind of a question, or she wants to come in. Dr. Surbi.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, first of all, my salutations to such a stalwart who has spoken and taken so much pain to explain that the king is below dharma. And we discussed yesterday with Rahul Diwanji also, he mentioned that, if somebody in the praja, yatha raja tatha praja, if the praja is sinning or erring at some time, then the raja, and if the raja is also sinning or erring at some time, the punishment for both should be alike, should be like. So this is, of course, very beautifully you have further, I should say, उस सूत्र को आपने further बढ़ाया है और बहुत खूबसूरती से आपने पिरोया है उसको एक Western tradition, एक European tradition, American tradition, whatever they have in terms of their governance, and then brought it back so skillfully and adroitly to the Indian context. मेरा एक बहुत सूक्ष्म प्रश्न है, and I would like to ask this question, that when you have taken this principle of Charles Darwin, when you say survival of the fittest, now Charles Darwin had also given a biological theory. I'm a doctor and a biologist at heart, and quite a keen scientist for linking the philosophies with science, So he had also mentioned, Darwin had mentioned struggle for existence.
Right.
Have you, in your thought process, gone through this principle as well? Does this fit in the governance of institutions, society, organizations somewhere? And how in the Hindu context we can, appreciate? Because I feel in my personal parlance, struggle for existence, if you can live by this principle only, then you are befittingly living the principle of survival of the fittest. So this is something very minute. I don't know
Right.
if I've raised the right pertinent question, but
Sure.
would request you
I
to
think,
kind of
yeah, like I understand a bit. So maybe I'll try to answer and then you can explain me that like it's in the same lines, right? So yeah, I think the struggle for existence is also like another like a famous concept from the Darwinian mold. I think the way I look at it is this whole idea of looking at existence as struggle and survival of fittest. All of this fits into the Matsyanaya sort of a world, the big fish, small fish sort of a world, right? Where the small fish is continuously threatened that it will be eaten and the bigger fish will come and eat the big fish. So that's sort of a threatened sort of a world. If you look at the Sanatan framework, it actually says that every single mode of livelihood and every single layer, right? Nobody is actually in this struggle. The struggle may be more in terms of the struggle towards coming out of these worldly things and then the struggle towards like liberation, moksha sort of a thing. It is not a struggle for existence. So our struggle never was really about like this hand-to-mouth sort of an existence. If you look at all of our own documentation, it was also not like I'm not saying everybody was like super rich and super prosperous or anything like that in the material terms. Whatever people had, they figured out a way in which to say to like be happy in that sort of a mold, and there was an ecosystem around them where it sort of limited the this sort of craving or greed in the material sphere and oriented people towards something that is beyond material. So where people really had this sort of struggle for existence, I would say is in terms of in this whole bhakti, upasana, that sort of a layer, right? Where people wanted to really do like, how can I get better, become as a bhakta? How can I get closer to my God? How can I get closer to this path of moksha? I think that is where we spend most of our energies on. Our struggle was really in that layer. It was not really in this layer because I think in that era, at least livelihoods were assured. Like I think the struggle now is that livelihoods are also not assured, and this transcendental spiritual sort of a layer also doesn't exist. So everybody is just stuck in fighting this material battle, and that is where it's like tailor-made for this Matsyanaya sort of a framework. That
Absolutely, absolutely. You hit the bullseye. And I was also wanting to, like kind of extract or to, be, for the audience that, this is also there in international polity today. Struggle for existence. Today, what we say that India as a nation, Bharat, jo Rashtra hai, Dharma Rajya hai. So, we have been as a Vishwa Guru always, and we have so much to offer to the world, so much to tell the nation, international polities rather. Now, I'm just bringing this context of Pahalgam in this reference. So I'm sure that you are able to understand the wavelength at which I'm speaking, that struggle for existence is also important, that Hindu dharma or Hindutva as a dharma rajya, or as a sect, as a so-called quote unquote religion, we have to assert our astitva, our asmita. It has to go unscathed, unfettered, undeterred. And this assertion, I think, is something which is from the process of evolution, if we can link it to that. So, your thoughts on this? I think.
Yeah, I think like it's more because of the modern predicament that things have grown this bad. Otherwise, I don't see like this sort of a struggle at the geopolitics or national level, right? I see that more as a post-colonial sort of a phenomenon where nations by themselves were so deprived, and every nation was like in that sort of a struggle mode, right? And then you also have this whole model where two or three countries pretty much have the most of the wealth today. Like the world is maybe like there are 194 odd nations, right? But maybe at best like two, three nations have most of the GDP. This sort of an imbalance also wasn't there in the past. So some of the struggles is also a manifestation of how things have become post colonization, where this whole global hegemony and then two or three countries like the Cold War, post Cold War, and all of that, right? So that's one aspect. Now, specifically coming to the like the Pahalgam, Pakistan, India sort of a situation. That is also like an unfortunate situation we have ended up because of how partition and all of that happened, right? Which again is in the same mold where like it started with the British machinations and then the colonial mindset and all of that. So I think that's like a very destructivist sort of a mindset, and that is what has resulted in all of this. But for us, specifically from a governance sort of a standpoint, definitely, I mean, if you look at any of the traditional sources for any king, first and foremost is the national security part of it, right? I mean, they have to protect that. So I think that is a non-negotiable. So again, even there, right? Even if you have to protect your state, you need to also understand what is your what has caused you to be in this state. So there again, you'll have to confront some of these questions. Like you'll also have to acknowledge how certain religions are prone to do certain actions and all of that, right? It's not an easy secular answer to it, because why is it that a lot of these non-Abrahamic cultures got wiped off in so many lands after colonization happened? Like why did all of these like Native American traditions, right? They just vanished in America, in Australia, in Canada, in all these places. And then if you look at how the like the Middle East and all of those continents, like Iran and all of these countries also, right? They also had several other religions before. Today, it doesn't. Like, why is Hinduism not there in Afghanistan? Why is Hinduism shrinking in Bangladesh? So all of that, right? I mean, you won't get a very secular answer to these questions. At some point, we'll have to say that if like my existence and my civilizational identity matters to me, you'll also have to confront this, that secularism is not the mind frame in which we have to confront this. I'll have to answer that for my religion, these are the 10 opposing forces. Out of those 10, maybe 6 are other religions. We'll also have to acknowledge that. I don't see a way out.
And I think Heliji has already answered spectacularly that for a Dharma Rajya to get established, I think that Dharma has to be accepted in toto. Today, the electoral political compulsions in the country, and Deen Dayalji in lecture 3 of Integral Humanism elucidates Abraham Lincoln's predicament at the time when he wanted to abolish slavery. And then he stood by his dharma, by his notion of American nation, and he had to withstand a widespread civil war at that point in time. So somewhere these contemporary questions of governance, they have a lot of I would say they have a lot of choices. It's a challenge out there, and that's where Heliji said that it's very tough because Hinduism or Hindu Dharma has to be accepted in totality in its own elaborate framework. We cannot just pick and choose, and that is what the predicament is actually happening. We are really in a state of confusion, which has come to a state of convolution per se, where we don't understand the tattva in its own originality. I think it has been a fantastic exhortation to commemorate these 60 momentous years of our Sanatani Vidya, which has been flowing on and on through these traditions. Thank you so much, Haley Kalyanji. एक
truly
कल्याणमय वक्तव्य आपका रहा, and without any euphemisms, and I think this kind of very daring roaring is actually needed to remove all the cobwebs and really establish that Surya, the Bhaskar of Sanatan Dharma, which is ennobling, which is all the positive mascot. Somewhere or the other, there is a kind of a imposed fear on of all of us, and it's really a delight that we have really got such a huge battery of young dharmic defenders all across, championing it all. Deen Dayal ji would be really in his Punya Lokas, he would be witnessing it all, and that's in the parampara, that ज्ञान परंपरा, it has been going on and on. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद हेली कल्याण जी। और इसके साथ हम ये जो इंटीग्रल इंडिक इंटेलिजेंस फोरम को विश्राम देते हैं। हमारे यहाँ कथाओं का समापन नहीं होता, वो तो विश्राम लेती हैं। एंड लेट दिस डिस्कोर्स गो ऑन एंड ऑन, यह ज्ञान यज्ञ चलता रहे और माँ भारती की सेवा में, और सनातन भारत की जो परंपरा है धार्मिक और मोक्षदायिनी, धर्म और अर्थ और काम तो है ही, उसके प्रति तो अनुसंधान होता ही है, पर धर्म आधारित और मोक्ष केंद्रित जो कामनाएं हैं उन्हीं के लिए अर्थानुसंधान हो। दिस इंटीग्रल क्वाड ऑफ पुरुषार्थास, व्हाट राघव कृष्णा जी ऑल्सो प्रेजेंटेड सो वेरी ब्यूटिफुली, और सहज में यह जो सारा फोरम गढ़ा, सहज में ये सभी मनीषी आए और उन्होंने यह, एंड वी होप दैट दीज टॉक्स वुड रियली गाइड the future endeavors of integral humanism which Rethink India intends to undertake. Thank you so much. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Raghav.
नमस्कार।
Thank you, sir.
Pranam.